In the last lesson, we talked about ink, and in this lesson, we're going to make a jam comic. So what's a jam comic? When I was younger, I started making comics where I would draw a panel and then I would hand it off to my sister, and then my sister would draw the next panel and we would go back and forth. But it wasn't until later that I realized that this was a pretty standard practice in comics, that a lot of people did this. So we're going to do like a solitary version of that, a jam comic by yourself. So for the first panel, I'm going to kind of introduce a non sequitur, just a random panel that will have a character, a setting, and maybe some dialogue. But really what's important on this first panel is just to give myself something fun to work with. I'm deciding that I'm going to draw the first panel with a vampire, and it's going to be in the city. Even when it's on a square piece of paper, I like drawing the panel border just because it kind of gives me like a viewfinder to look into the world. It helps me think about it a little bit more. I'm going to have a vampire, maybe a sad vampire, kind of hovering down the street. And when you're working on your non sequiturs, it's really just what you like to draw. I like introducing things that I just find fun to draw. So for this, I'm kind of treating it like it's a rough draft. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to show what I want it to show in as simple way as possible. We use some of our texture marks that we learned from inking. It's the asphalt, and he'll be coming down the street. So we have overlap, so the character's kind of hovering in this space. Draw the curb, maybe the texture of the cement. There's gonna be a sidewalk there, maybe some trash cans. I'm just kind of making an environment that I think is interesting to exist in for this character. Maybe I'll draw some bricks on the side of this building to show that it has a surface, maybe even a window. Maybe he'll be crying an actual tear. So this gives me enough to kind of think about what I'm going to do in the next panel. So for the first panel, I chose to have the character front and center and hovering here. I like to think about each one of my panels as a vignette of sorts, but also kind of like a diorama, as if I'm looking into a box and I'm looking at what matters. So for this panel, I've decided what matters is that there's a sad vampire floating down the street. So it is important to me to show what kind of environment he exists in, but also that he's sad and that he's going somewhere. In the next panel, I'm going to draw what happens before that. So now I have to think about what happens before this panel. I'm going to have a small argument with a werewolf. The important thing about this image is that there's going to be an argument between the vampire and the werewolf, so I'm going to have that sort of front and center. And I have to give the werewolf and the vampire something to argue about, so I'm just right away going to introduce some dialogue here. When I put words in, I try to put my words in early, so I don't have to put my words around the picture. I'm going to have the vampire say, or the werewolf say, "It is your turn to wash the dishes." I like having kind of expressive word balloons. And then I'll have the vampire say, "But I need to meet my mummy for lunch." This is where the sadness is coming in, because he has to do dishes, but also he has to meet his mother for lunch, or his mummy. Okay. I like using body language in my comics because the more you can convey with body language, the better, because then you don't have to get too much into the words. One of the nice things about comics is that you can really try to express things just in pictures. I haven't finished the werewolf yet, so I gotta do that. Maybe I'll have some drool coming out of his mouth, very werewolf-like. Maybe he'll be wearing a plaid shirt. I could draw it nicer, but I'm really just trying to get the energy. If I want to make a nicer version later, I can. I'm going to have it on the same street, but just a different angle. They're just arguing out in the street. I do think that adding too many details when they're unnecessary can become a problem. I do think that having things like setting are important, but if it gets in the way of a good story, then you can sometimes drop the setting. The next panel I'm going to do after the vampire is floating down the street. Start again with my viewfinder in here, panel borders. I'm going to kind of break scene. I'm going to draw the restaurant in the distance. Let's make it Italian food. So there's going to be a sign up here that says Italian. So I'll make the sign here, and then the windows, some large windows here. Sitting at the table, going to draw a mummy, maybe with some wine, like a wine glass. The mummy will be waiting here at the restaurant. In the severe distance, I'll draw a skyline of the city. And in the severe foreground, I will draw the vampire coming into frame, looking slightly worried because now he realizes that he has to do dishes instead of going out for dinner. He has to break it to the mummy that he will not be eating. One of the things that is really nice about making comics is that you don't have to keep drawing the next moment. You can experiment by showing us different things, like different settings, to make us experience time in a different way. So you can jump not just to the next moment, but you can jump to the next scene, or you can jump to a different subject. You can do all sorts of things in comics. Just by getting to this restaurant, I have transported us to another time and place. Now I'll think, how will I break it to her? Getting a little crowded here. And just like a word balloon before, where you can hear what somebody is saying, in comics you can also show us what they're thinking. So here I'm going to use a thought balloon instead, and this is what the vampire is thinking. So I'm going to continue with this jam comic. I'm going to draw 3 more panels. Let's see what I come up with. Now I'm going to do the last panel. Let's see if it makes any sense. You've noticed that I wrote it a little bit out of order. When you're working this way with index cards or with scraps of paper, you can use it to your advantage. You can insert moments if a moment goes too quickly. You can take moments out if it seems like too much. It's really a nice flexible way to make a comic your first go. In the beginning, I started with the vampire going down the street, but then I decided that beforehand I wanted to give the vampire a reason to cry. So I drew this moment where he's having this argument with his roommate, the werewolf. So we have this sort of chaotic moment followed by this quiet, kind of contemplative moment where the vampire was presumably thinking about how to break it to his mummy about how he's not going to have dinner anymore. We transport ourselves to another time and place, to the location of the Italian restaurant, and then inside where we meet the last character. They have a little bit of a discussion. We show our setting. Maybe there should have been a candlelight or something like that, but has a nice atmosphere, at least with the shading on the window, gives it a little bit of a nice atmosphere. And then I introduce a new scene, the apartment, where the dishes still haven't been done. And I use narration to bring us to another time and place. Narration is a really good way of doing that without it being confusing to the reader. So I have the werewolf thinking about the dishes and that he's angry about the circumstances around the dishes. And then we go back to the restaurant where off in the distance, you see the werewolf coming and is still angry. But it turns out that the mummy and the vampire were still able to have a nice quiet time together, where we assume that maybe the doggy bag will make up for the slowness in washing dishes. So in general, I just want to kind of talk about the composition of them as a whole. Each panel kind of leads us into the next panel, where the direction of the action or even the direction of the collective pieces sort of guide our eye. That's a really nice thing about comics, is that we're not working with just words, we're working with images. So it's good to sort of steer the reader and show the reader where the next panel is and have that transition feel really nice and natural. Just by having, for instance, this character here, the werewolf in the dishes, we have all this clutter, but the main focus is still the werewolf and his anger, which kind of guides us through that panel. So the thing I really like about this project is that you're able to come up with something on your own, but jam comics in general are really fun to do with a partner. So if you have a friend that likes to draw and you can hang out in the same space, try drawing the first panel and then passing it back and forth, each developing the story one panel by one panel and seeing where it goes. So we played around with jam comics, and in our next lesson, we're going to work on writing a story.